The desert doesn't bargain. A man lies half buried in the red dirt where the flash flood left him. His fingers curl toward the Colt at his side, slow, automatic, the way a dying animal still bares its teeth. Then the voices reach him. Low, rhythmic, Chiricahua, the same tongue that once followed him through nightmares. He never told anyone about. He forces his eyes open. She is already there. Kneeling. A young woman with eyes like the deep places between the rocks. Her hand covers his on the gun, not gripping, not stopping, simply present. As if she has decided this moment belongs to her now. More shadows detach from the canyon walls. Men, watching. Rifles low but ready, the wind dies. And in that sudden quiet, the desert leans in close to listen. The desert doesn't care who you are. That's the first thing you learn out here. The second thing, usually too late, is that it doesn't care who you were. Either Silas Cord learned both lessons in the same week. He was 32 years old and looked 50. Not because life had been cruel to him. Life had been plenty of things to Silas Cord. Indifferent mostly, occasionally generous, sometimes devastating. But cruel? No, cruel required intention. What happened to Silas Cord wasn't intentional. It was just a series of choices that seemed reasonable at the time. That's the thing about choices that destroy you. They never announce themselves. They show up dressed like practicality, like responsibility, like just one more season, and then I'll go home. He'd been working cattle drives since he was 19. Before that, Army. Before that, a farm in Missouri that his father lost to debt when Silas was 16. He'd been moving ever since. Always moving. Always toward something, money. Stability, a reason to stop. And always, somehow, still moving. His hands told the story of it. Scarred across the knuckles, calloused so thick he could press a hot brand against his palm and feel it only as pressure. Not pain anymore, just pressure. He wore his hat low and his words lower. Men on the drive learned quickly that conversation with Silas Cord was more effort than it was worth. Not because he was mean, not because he was stupid, because he was somewhere else. Even when he was standing right in front of you, watching your mouth move, nodding at the right moments, he was somewhere else entirely. That somewhere else had a name. Her name was Clara. The flashback doesn't come in order. It never does. It comes in pieces. The way memory always works when you're trying not to remember. First, the smell of her hair, warm, like bread, and something floral he never thought to identify when she was alive, and now he would give his right hand to name. Then, the sound of his son laughing. Thomas. 3 years old when Silas last held him. 3 years old, and already stubborn about everything. What he ate, what direction he walked. Whether he would wear shoes in winter, that last one especially. A fight every single morning. Silas would give anything to fight that fight again. Then the letter. He'd been working a drive in New Mexico when it came. Cholera, the letter said. The town had it bad. Clara went first. Thomas 3 days after. He'd read the letter 3 times standing in the middle of camp. Then he folded it very carefully and put it in his breast pocket. Then he went back to work. Someone asked him later if he was all right. He said yes. He went back to work. That was 1880. 3 years ago now. And the thing he couldn't tell anyone, the thing couldn't even let himself think, directly, only approach from the side, like looking at the sun, was this. He had known the town was sick, not before he left. Before he left, he didn't know. He'd kissed Clara on the cheek and told Thomas to wear his shoes and climbed onto his horse and headed south with the drive, and that was all normal. That was all fine. But 3 weeks in, he'd gotten word. Town sickness moving through the valley, bad strain. He'd thought about going back. He'd even saddled his horse. And then the trail boss had offered him double wages for the rest of the season because 3 men had quit, and Silas had thought, 1 more month. Get the money. Clara would want the money. We need the money for spring. Practical, responsible. 1 more month. He unsaddled the horse and went back to work. And now Clara was 3 years in the ground, and Thomas was 3 years in the ground, and Silas Cord was here. Arizona Territory, 1883. working cattle for a man named Afield who smelled like tobacco, and never once looked at anyone directly when he spoke to them. Some choices don't destroy you, all at once. They do it slowly, season by season, year by year. Until, one day you look in a river and the face looking back at you is a stranger. The day it all fell apart was a Thursday. Probably, he thought it was Thursday. The days blurred out here. The drive was moving north through the San Pedro River Valley, 40 miles east of Tucson. Dry heat, the kind that pressed against your face like a flat iron. The cows were miserable. The men were more miserable. And Silas had made the mistake, the extraordinary, catastrophic mistake, of being right about something. In front of Afield, it wasn't even a big thing. He'd said the creek crossing 2 miles ahead was running faster than usual. He'd said they should push the herd left and take the long way around. He'd said this calmly, with evidence. He'd scouted that morning. He'd seen the water level. He knew what flash floods looked like before they happened because he'd spent enough years reading this land. Afield had looked at him the way certain men look at any other man who demonstrates competence. Like it was an insult. I didn't ask for your opinion, Cord, I know. I'm giving it free. That was Silas's mistake. Not the opinion. The free, men like Afield didn't like free things. Free things implied that the giver had something to spare, something you didn't have. Afield couldn't stand that, they argued. Briefly, Silas wasn't a man who argued long. He stated his position, repeated it once with slightly more words, and then went quiet. That quiet was worse than the arguing, apparently, because Afield's face went red and stayed red, and by the end of the exchange he was sputtering about insubordination and thinking too highly of yourself for a trail hand. And then a man named Welch stepped forward. Welch was older, mid-50s. He'd been watching Silas all week, with the particular attention of someone trying to place a face. And now, in this moment of commotion, the placement clicked. Afield, Welch said, quietly. The kind of quiet that made everyone nearby turn around. You know who this man is? Afield didn't. Army Scout. 3rd Cavalry. He was in the Dragoon raid. Silas went very still. March of 78. Welch continued. He wasn't angry about it. That was the strange part. He was almost conversational. Chiricahua camp. 6 dead. Army said it was a defensive engagement. A pause. Wasn't defensive. The camp went quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight. Silas didn't deny it. He looked at Welch, looked at Afield, looked at the other men whose faces were doing various things. Surprise, disgust, wariness. The particular calculation of men who are deciding whether this is their problem or not. He went to his tent. He packed his bedroll, his canteen, his knife, his father's old Colt revolver, and a small tintype photograph of Clara that he never looked at directly but could not leave behind. He was out of camp in less than 10 minutes. Nobody stopped him. Nobody was going to. He didn't ride out with his chin up. He didn't make it mean something. He just left. The way he always left. The way that was becoming, he understood, somewhere underneath everything, a kind of sickness. A habit so deep it had become reflex. Afield called something after him. He didn't catch it. The desert swallowed him whole. Now here is what the desert does to a man on foot without a horse. First it takes the moisture out of your skin, out of your eyes, out of the corners of your mouth until your lips crack and bleed, and the blood dries almost before it forms. The air is so dry it drinks you. Then it takes your sense of distance. Everything out here looks 3 miles away and is actually 10. Or looks 10 away and is actually 2. The saguaro cactus, those massive columns of green that rise 20, 30, 40 feet against the sky. They warp your perspective. You walk toward one for an hour, and you're not sure if you're getting closer. The light does things, bends things, makes mirages that your brain knows are mirages, and your mouth still wants to drink. Then, if it has time, it takes your thoughts. Not all at once, not dramatically, slowly. Like someone quietly removing the furniture from a room until you're standing in an empty space. You're not sure when everything disappeared. The storm came on his second day alone. He'd seen it building from the southwest all morning, a wall of brown. Not a thunderstorm, those he could work with. This was something else entirely. A wall of displaced sand and dust, 50 feet high and miles wide, moving like a living thing and eating the horizon as it came. He had exactly enough time to tie his bandana over his mouth and nose, pull his hat low, and get behind the largest boulder he could find before it hit. Then it hit. He'd been in sandstorms before. He'd never been in one like this. The sound was, there's no good word for it, like standing inside a freight train that is also on fire. The sand found every gap in his clothing, his bandana, the seal between his hat brim and his ears. It got in his eyes despite everything. He kept them shut and held onto the boulder and waited. What he didn't know, couldn't know, behind the boulder, with his eyes shut, was that the dry riverbed 50 yards to his north had just received, in the space of 3 hours, the runoff from a cloudburst 30 miles away in the Chiricahua high country. What came was quiet, almost a kind of rushing sound, underneath the storm noise. Low, getting louder. Then the flash flood hit. It wasn't a wall of water. Not out here. Out here it was more like the earth liquefying. A surge of water and mud and debris moving fast and low, filling the channel of the dry riverbed in seconds and spilling outward. His horse, which he'd been leading, not riding, conserving the animal's energy in the heat, was tied to a mesquite tree on the near bank. The mesquite tree did not survive. Neither did his supplies. He lost the horse. Lost the saddlebags with 3 days of food and the extra canteen. Lost his bedroll and his spare ammunition. And the small cooking pot that he'd had for 11 years. He kept the Colt, kept the tintype, kept his knife, kept the bandana over his face. And then the storm passed and the water passed, and Silas Cord stood in the middle of the desert with nothing. Dragoon Mountains ahead of him, San Pedro Valley behind him. No map because he hadn't needed one. No food. Half a canteen of water that had somehow survived because it was on his hip. No horse. He stood there for a long moment. Then he started walking. He ate prickly pear that night, sliced the pads open with his knife, and scraped out the wet pulp, ignoring the spines that he couldn't get all the way out of his fingers. It tasted like nothing. Like water wearing a disguise, he rationed the canteen. Half a swallow at dusk, half a swallow at midnight, half at dawn. He walked at night and rested in shade during the worst of the afternoon heat. He knew enough to do that. His army years, and then all the years after, had taught him how to move through this land. Not live in it the way the people who belonged here lived in it, but survive it. For a while. For a while had its limits. By the third day, those limits were visible on the horizon. He was in the Dragoon Mountains proper now, red granite rising around him. Massive formations tumbled and stacked by geological time into shapes that suggested things, faces, animals, doorways. The sky above them was a brutal blue, not the comforting kind, the kind that made you aware of exactly how small you were underneath it. The hallucinations started small, a flicker at the edge of vision, a sound that wasn't wind. He knew what they were. He'd been there before, in the army. A bad week, without water in the Sonoran. He recognized the early signs and told himself to stop taking them seriously. Then Clara appeared. She was sitting on a flat rock about 20 feet ahead of him, just sitting, hands in her lap. She was wearing the blue dress she'd worn on their wedding day. Her hair was the way she'd worn it on ordinary days, not up, not elaborate, just her hair the way it actually was. He stopped walking. She looked at him. He waited for her to say something. To tell him he was going to be all right, or to tell him she forgave him, or to tell him what he should have done. He'd had this hallucination before, or something like it, and in the other versions she always said something, always gave him something to hold on to. This time she just looked at him, and somehow that was worse, because in her eyes, or in whatever his dehydrated brain was constructing as her eyes, there was nothing that felt like anger, nothing that felt like accusation, just looking. The way you look at someone you love when you're trying to memorize them. The way you look when you understand that looking is all that's left. He didn't deserve forgiveness. He hadn't earned it. And Clara, even in this terrible and private theater his mind was staging, wasn't going to give him something he hadn't earned. She disappeared when he blinked. He sat down against the rock and breathed very carefully for several minutes. Then he got up and kept walking. Because that's the thing about Silas Cord. He didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Stopping felt too much like giving up, and giving up felt too much like a choice, a real one, with intention, and he was done making choices. He'd been done with choices since 1880. He just kept moving, the same way he'd always kept moving. Not toward anything, not away from anything, just moving. He made it another mile before his legs went. He went down slowly, not dramatically, just sat down in the dirt beside a large mesquite tree, and then lay back and looked at the sky and thought, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful. This is probably where it ends. The sky was very blue. The rock was warm against his back. He closed his eyes. He heard voices before he felt anything, 2 voices, speaking in a language he recognized, not the words but the shape of it, the rhythm, Chiricahua. He'd been around enough Apache camps in his scouting years to know the sound of it without understanding it. His hand moved to the Colt. Reflex, completely involuntary. He didn't decide to do it, his body decided, and then a hand touched his, not grabbing, not restraining, just touching. The fingertips of a woman's hand pressing gently over his gun hand, not taking the weapon, not stopping him, just making contact. A human presence. He opened his eyes. She was young, 25 maybe. Dark hair pulled back. Eyes so dark they absorbed light rather than reflecting it. She was looking at him with an expression he'd seen before. He was trying to place it, and then he had it. It was the same expression his mother had used when she was assessing whether something was worth saving. Practical, focused, not unkind. She said something to him in Chiricahua, he said, with a voice that came out as mostly gravel. Water, she understood that much, produced a water pouch from somewhere, animal hide, tightly sealed, and put it to his lips, herself, because she'd apparently clocked that his hands weren't fully functional at the moment. He drank. She controlled how much. Pulled the pouch back before he'd finished. He almost grabbed for it. She held it just out of reach and shook her head once. Firmly. He understood too much too fast. He'd known that. His body had just not cared about knowing things. He lay back, behind her, slightly uphill. A young man, her brother, maybe similar bone structure, maybe 16 years old, stood watching with the careful stillness of someone who'd been taught to read situations before reacting to them. She called something to him. He moved fast, going uphill, back the way they'd come. She turned back to Silas. He was trying to find the words. "Thank you. My name is, I'm not a threat. All the things you said when you were a stranger, in someone else's territory and you knew it." He was working on the words. But she was already looking at him in a way that made the words seem beside the point. It wasn't warmth exactly. Not yet. It was something more complicated than warmth, more useful. She was looking at him the way old Bessa, though Silas wouldn't learn that name until later, had described to her. The man with the quiet grief, the man who carries something he hasn't put down yet. She didn't know why she believed the old woman. She usually did, though. Old Bessa had a record of being right about things that shouldn't be knowable. She made a decision. She started calling out. Loud, clear, carrying across the rocks. Other voices answered from somewhere over the ridge. Moving toward them, Silas lay still, looked at the sky, listened to the sound of people coming. He was too tired to be afraid. He was too tired for most things. His hand was still on the Colt. He took it off. Put the hand flat on the dirt beside him. The woman noticed. She nodded once. He closed his eyes again. He learned her name in pieces. The first piece came when she introduced herself to him in camp, after he'd been carried there, half-conscious, by 2 men who said nothing and handled him like furniture. And she said a word he couldn't catch correctly, on the first or second try but eventually landed as Tahani. The second piece came from the way other people said it, with a specific inflection, not just a name that came with weight, with status. Like when you said it, you were acknowledging something. He was lying in the shade of a wickiup, a dome structure of bent branches and brush, surprisingly cool inside, when he started putting things together. The camp was not what he expected, which told him more about his expectations than about the camp. He'd been in Apache territory before, in his scouting days, which he was actively trying not to think about right now. He'd seen camps ranging from hasty and temporary to established and complex. This one was established. Orderly. 20, maybe 25 structures in a shallow canyon with a hidden spring. Horses corralled in a natural alcove. Children visible, which told him immediately that this was home, not a raiding or war camp. Children meant family. Family meant different rules. People moved past the entrance of his wickiup with the particular casualness of people who have decided not to actively stare but are absolutely aware of exactly where he is. He didn't blame them. The man, boy, really, who'd been with Tahani when they found him came and crouched in the entrance. Naru. That was what Tahani called him, her brother. He had the same directness in his eyes. Different energy, though, young energy. The kind that wasn't afraid, because it hadn't yet learned how many things deserved fear. Naru pointed at Silas's canteen, which was sitting beside him. Silas handed it over. Naru inspected it, turned it over. It had an army stamp on the base. Naru looked at Silas, then at the stamp. Back at Silas, Army? Naru said. Used to be, Silas said. Naru considered this for a long moment. The way a 16-year-old who has learned to be serious about things considers them. He handed the canteen back. He didn't leave. He just stayed crouched in the entrance, watching, which meant he'd been assigned there. Silas understood. Someone was keeping an eye. He lay back and stared at the wickiup ceiling. Somewhere in the camp, a drum was beating, not loud. Low, like a heartbeat that wasn't his. He fell asleep. The council happened in the evening. He was brought out, not roughly, but firmly, with two men at his sides who communicated very clearly through posture that this was not optional, and seated in front of a fire. Around the fire sat the senior members of the band. He counted 7. 8 if you included the old woman sitting slightly behind, and to the left, white-haired, still as stone, watching him with the intensity of someone who had decided that the truth about him was visible and was simply waiting to see it. At the center of the circle sat the man who was clearly in charge. Chief Kalfas was older than Silas expected, 60 maybe, white at his temples, a face that had been weathered by decades of exactly the kind of living that weathered faces is. He was not a large man, he was a still man, the stillness of someone who had never needed to prove anything with movement. You are in the presence of authority, his stillness said. You know it, I know it, there's no reason to perform it. There was a young man, late 20s, standing at the outer ring of the fire's light, not sitting, standing. Arms crossed. Watching this one was different, not hostile exactly, but not neutral either. He had the look of someone who had filed information and was waiting for more before deciding what to do with it. Later, Silas would learn his name was Zarek. Later, he would learn what Zarek had filed. A man who spoke enough English to translate stood beside Chief Kalfas, and they began. The questions were simple. Who was he? Where was he going? Why was he in this territory? Did he have others with him? Silas answered simply. He gave his name, said he'd been working a cattle drive, had gotten separated in the storm, was alone, was not scouting, was not looking for anything or anyone. He answered each question the same way he'd answered everything for 3 years, with the minimum necessary truth delivered flatly. He didn't mention the army. He didn't mention 1878. He looked at Chief Kalfas when he spoke, not at the translator. That seemed like the right call. Eyes on the actual power in the room. Chief Kalfas asked the translator something. The translator asked Silas, "Why should we trust what you say?" Silas thought about it for a moment. "You shouldn't," he said. "Not yet. Trust is for later. Right now I'm just asking for shelter while I'm able to travel again." The translator rendered this. Chief Kalfas listened. Something moved in his face. Not quite a reaction. More like an acknowledgement. Like a point on a scale tilting slightly. There was discussion. Silas sat and waited, and didn't move. Tehani said something from the back. She was standing slightly outside the main circle. She said it clearly, and whatever it was, several people around the fire reacted. Not agreement. Exact the kind of attention that meant what she'd said had weight. Kalfas looked at her for a moment, then at Silas. He said something. Short the translator. "You stay. Limited movement. No weapons. You work. You do not leave camp without permission. You cause trouble. This ends." Silas nodded. Understood, and at the outer ring of the fire's light, Zarek watched him. Not angrily, carefully. The way you watch someone when you're holding information and you're deciding not whether to use it. But when that night, Silas slept at the edge of the camp, not in the wickiup they'd used before. Further out. A spot close enough to be technically inside the boundary, far enough to be clearly marked as other. A man positioned at the perimeter. He understood the message. He didn't argue with it. He lay on his back and looked at the stars. Arizona Territory stars were. There was something almost aggressive about them. Too bright. Too many. Like the sky was compensating for how merciless the daytime was, as if it felt bad about the sun and was trying to apologize with stars. He thought about March of 1878. He thought about it the way he always thought about it, briefly, and then he redirected, because full attention to that memory was something he'd learned to ration. Too much and it became something he couldn't come back from. So he skimmed it, like a rock across water. Touch and move on. Someone would come looking. Eventually. He'd brought that with him to this camp like he'd brought the photograph and the Colt. Things he couldn't leave behind, even when he wanted to. He closed his eyes. He did not sleep well, but he slept. And in the morning, when he woke before dawn and lay in that quiet space between dark and first light, the desert cooling fast, his breath almost visible, the silence complete, he became aware of something that took him a moment to identify. He didn't feel the need to get up and go. That was new, not comfortable, not resolved. Not anything as straightforward as peace. Just the absence, for the first time in 3 years, of that constant low-frequency pull toward the door. That compulsive forward movement. That go, keep going. If you stop, you'll have to feel it. He lay still. The desert breathed around him, and Silas Cord, who had not been still in 3 years, stayed still. The kicker arrived the next morning. Silas was stacking firewood, his first assigned task, communicated through gestures with complete clarity, when a young soldier rode into the visible range of the canyon's lookout. He didn't come in. The camp's approach was known only to those who knew it. The soldier stopped at the canyon mouth and waited. One of the camp's men rode out to meet him. They exchanged something. The camp man came back. Went to Kalfas's wickiup. Silas kept stacking firewood. He watched without appearing to watch. This was a skill, peripheral attention. You learned it young, or you didn't survive certain situations. And Silas had learned it young. 10 minutes later, Tahani appeared beside him. She had a roll of paper. She'd clearly been briefed by her father. She held it out to him without preamble. He took it, a letter from the United States Army, 6th Cavalry, addressed to Chief Kalfas in the name of Lieutenant J.R. Groover, Fort Bowie, Arizona Territory. His English was formal and careful. The Army was conducting a survey of the Dragoon Mountain region in accordance with provisions of the 1882 Indian Appropriations Act. This survey would commence within 30 days. All persons found within the survey boundaries would be subject to inquiry and documentation. Cooperation was expected. Silas read it twice. He'd worked with the Army long enough to read what wasn't written. Survey meant documentation. Documentation meant a record of exactly who was here and what claim they had to being here. Records meant the next step, which was a formal review of that claim. Which meant, if the record didn't satisfy certain people in Washington, the step after that, which was San Carlos, the reservation, 100 miles north, in a strip of territory that had been chosen by people who'd never been there, for people who had always been here. Chosen for its uselessness, mostly. For how little anyone else wanted it. He also saw, because he knew how to read these letters, because he'd delivered enough of them, the line that everyone else might have missed. The survey team would note the presence of any Army personnel or veterans in the area for the purposes of updating regimental records. Veterans, not enemy combatants, not fugitives, veterans. He'd been designated a deserter in '79. Unofficially, he'd just stopped showing up, which in those years wasn't always formally processed right away. But someone had processed it eventually, and whoever Welch had talked to, and Welch was the kind of man who talked, had updated the Silas cord. Last known location, Eastern Arizona Territory. He handed the letter back to Tahani. She was watching him with that assessing look again. He kept his face neutral, but under the neutral, something was doing a slow, cold calculation. He hadn't just brought his history here. His history had followed him here. And now it was standing at the canyon mouth, in the form of a letter, and it had 30 days to become something much solid. "Everything all right?" Naru asked from behind him. His English, it turned out, was better than just one word. Silas looked at the kid, at the camp around them, at Tahani, who was rereading the letter with a stillness that looked like calm and probably wasn't. "Not yet," he said. He picked up another log and added it to the pile. The desert held its breath, and 30 days in Arizona in 1883 was either a very long time or no time at all, depending on what was coming. The first thing they gave him was an axe. Not a gift, not a welcome. A tool dropped in front of him at dawn by a man who pointed at a pile of unsplit timber and then walked away without looking back. Silas picked up the axe. He split wood for 4 hours. Nobody watched, or rather, everyone watched. But nobody appeared to watch. That was the difference. Children who were supposedly playing drifted gradually closer. Women moving between wickiups took slightly longer routes that put them within peripheral range. Men going about their own business arranged themselves at angles that included him in their sight lines. He split the wood and didn't look at any of them directly, because direct looking would be a confrontation, and he wasn't here to confront anything. He was here because his legs had given out in the desert, and a woman with dark eyes and a practical expression had put water to his lips. So, wood. He split it cleanly. That was all he could offer right now. Clean work, done right, without complaint. By the 3rd hour, his shoulders were burning. By the 4th, his hands had opened up in 2 places where old calluses had cracked in the desert dryness, blood on the axe handle. He wrapped them with strips from his bandana and kept going. Nobody brought him water. He didn't ask. Naru brought him water. The kid appeared beside him at some point past the 3rd hour, silently, holding a clay pot. He set it on a nearby rock and stood back with his arms crossed and his chin slightly up. Like he hadn't done anything, like the water was just there, and he had nothing to do with it. Silas drank, set the pot back on the rock. "Thank you," he said. Naru shrugged elaborately, wandered off, reappeared 30 yards away looking at the sky. Silas looked away before the kid could see his face. The camp had a rhythm, and he learned it the way you learn any foreign language. Not by studying, by immersion, by making mistakes and watching what happened and adjusting. He learned that the morning hours belonged to the women, water gathering, food preparation, work that required the cooler air. Men moved differently in the morning, less obviously purposeful, more observational. He learned to read the difference between a man walking somewhere and a man positioning himself. He learned that the horses were the clearest social map of the band. Who cared for which animals told you almost everything about status and relationship? The best horses were tended by the warriors. The children had access to the gentler ones. There was a gray mare that nobody seemed to officially own, but that Tahani visited every morning and every evening, pressing her forehead to the animals and speaking quietly. Naru's younger brother, Danu, maybe 12, had claimed the corral as his personal territory. He was there every morning, before the horses were fed, and every evening after. Nobody had assigned him there, he'd simply decided it was his. Silas understood that completely. He didn't ask about the mare, but he noticed. He fixed a wickiup frame that had cracked. Nobody asked him to. He'd seen it leaning wrong and understood the structural problem, and spent an afternoon correcting it with material he found nearby. The family who lived there, a woman and 3 young children, husband presumably away, came back to find the frame straight. The woman looked at it, looked at him, said nothing, went inside. But the next morning there was food outside the place where he slept. Not much. Flatbread and a small piece of dried venison. Enough. He ate it slowly, sitting in the early light, and tried not to think about how long it had been since someone had fed him. He was not a man who knew how to receive things. He'd been on the giving end of transactions his whole life. Labor for wages, service for shelter. The receiving end made him uncomfortable, in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Like debt, like obligation. Like something was now expected of him that he might not be able to provide. But he ate the bread. And that was something. He found other ways to be useful. Small ways, the kind that didn't require permission or announcement. He noticed things. He had always noticed things. A life of moving through unfamiliar territory trained you to read what was in front of you fast, to catalog threat and resource and relationship without appearing to do any of it. Here he turned that skill toward something different. He noticed which families were stretched thin, which elders moved with the careful deliberation of old joints that needed warming up before they worked properly, which children had claimed which corners of the camp as their own particular territory. He didn't interfere. He offered. There was a difference, and he was careful about it. A bucket that had cracked along the seam and was losing water. He mended it with pine pitch he found near the southern tree line, learned by watching how others in the camp maintained their equipment. He left it outside the family's wickiup without comment. He sharpened tools, quietly. Setting the whetstone angle right took practice, but he had the patience for it. And a good edge on a knife or a scraper was the kind of thing people noticed but rarely attributed. These were small things. They added up slowly. The way trust always adds up, not in declarations, but in the accumulation of where someone did what they said they would do, or did what needed doing without being asked, or simply showed up again when they could have gone. Tahani came at dusk. That was when she came. He was learning. Not at the busy times. Not when there were people watching who would have opinions. At the in-between time. The hour when the sky went from blue to orange to that particular purple that existed only here, over the Dragoon Mountains. Like the landscape was the only place in the world that color had decided to live. She sat down near where he was working. He'd been given rope to braid, which was mind-numbing, but required just enough attention to keep you from thinking too hard. And she began teaching him without announcing that she was teaching him. She pointed at the fire, said a word. He tried to repeat it. She shook her head, waited, said it again, slower. He tried again, better not right, but the shape of it improving. She moved to the next thing, the rope in his hands. A word, he tried, failed. Tried again. Got closer. This continued for an hour. She never showed impatience. She never showed amusement at his failures, which he appreciated more than he would have expected. He'd always hated being laughed at for not knowing things. He'd developed a reflex of pretending to know things because of it, which had caused its own problems over the years. But she just waited, and repeated, and moved on. By the end of the hour he had 7 words. Real words, pronounceable, meaning anchored fire, water, rock, horse, morning. Sleep, stop, she taught him last. with a particular emphasis, like she wanted to make sure he had that one. He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the fire. "You're teaching me the useful ones," he said. Not a question. She didn't respond to that. Possibly because she didn't have full English. Possibly because she did and decided not to confirm it. Either way, he learned stop. The evenings were the hardest part. Not because anything bad happened in the evenings, but because in the evenings the camp became something warmer. Fires were lit. Families gathered. The sound of children arguing and laughing and being pulled towards sleep filled the air. Old Bessa. He'd learned her name by then. The white-haired woman who watched him like she was reading something. Sat in front of her wickiup every evening and told stories. He couldn't understand them. But the cadence of her voice was unmistakable. The way children leaned in. The way adults paused nearby, pretending to be doing other things. He sat at his perimeter spot and listened to the shape of it. Home, his brain said helpfully. "This is what home sounds like." "Shut up," the rest of him replied, because here was the thing. He had been in this camp for 9 days, and for 9 days, he had experienced something he had no clean name for. Not happiness, not relief, not belonging. Those were all too big, too clear. What he felt was closer to "I can breathe here," which was absurd, which was insane, which was he was a stranger here. He was an outsider. He was, in ways he was very carefully not thinking about, something worse than an outsider. He was the man who had put 6 of these people in the ground 5 years ago. That fact sat in his chest like a stone. He'd gone to sleep 9 nights now with that stone in his chest. He was going to go to sleep tonight with it. He would wake up with it tomorrow. It was not going anywhere. And still, he could breathe. The snake happened on the 12th day. He wasn't there when it started. He was on the south side of camp, repairing a section of horse corral fencing, when he heard Tehani's voice, not a scream, not even particularly loud, but a sharp, immediate shift in tone that made every animal within range go still. He was moving before he made the decision to move. Around the far side of a boulder, in a gap between rocks where the afternoon shadow pooled and kept cool, a western diamondback had positioned itself, thick, long, coiled, which was worse than extended. Extended was a snake that might be moving through. Coiled was a snake that had decided to stay. Tehani was 3 feet from it. She'd rounded the boulder and almost stepped on it. She was standing absolutely still now, which was the right thing, but her right foot was forward, and the weight transfer was incomplete. And if she tried to pull back, she'd have to shift and... He came around the other side of the boulder. Slow, controlled. Not dramatic. Just moving. He picked up a rock. Not large. The right size. The right weight. He placed himself between Tehani and the snake. The snake tracked toward him, which was what he wanted. Attention on him. Attention off her. "Back," he said to her. Not looking at her. Eyes on the snake. She moved backward. Smooth, good footwork, no sudden weight shifts. He waited and waited. The snake's attention flickered, that tiny moment of recalibration, and he threw the rock. Not at the snake, past it, hard against the far boulder, the sound and movement together. The snake reacted the way they always did, toward the disturbance and then past it, moving away, finding a gap in the rocks and disappearing into it in seconds. Gone, sight-fapons. He turned around. Tehani was standing 4 feet behind him, looking at the gap where the snake had been. Then at him. Her expression was. He expected gratitude or relief or the slightly exasperated look of someone who's been scared and is covering it. What he got was different. She was looking at him with an expression he could not entirely read, something that had assessment in it. Something that was adjusting some internal calculation she'd been running. "You didn't kill it," she said. Her English was better than she'd been letting on. He looked at the gap in the rocks. "Wasn't bothering anyone until we bothered it," he said. She said nothing for a moment, then. "Old Bessa wants to speak with you tonight." She walked past him, back toward the camp. Her footsteps on the rock were quiet and even. His heart was doing something inconvenient, and he told it to stop. It did not stop. Old Bessa spoke through Tahani that night. They sat at the old woman's fire, the three of them. Bessa studied him for a long time before she said anything. He held still under it. He'd been held under worse. Bessa said something. Tahani translated. She says she dreamed about you before you arrived. He didn't know what to do with that. She says the dream showed a man carrying two shadows. One was grief. The other one she couldn't see clearly. She wants to know what the second shadow is. The fire crackled. He looked at Bessa. She was looking back at him with those still ancient eyes. She knew. He understood suddenly that she knew. The question wasn't a question. It was an invitation. A door she was holding open. He could close it. Walk away. He was good at that. He didn't close it. Tell her I did something I can't undo, he said. And I've been moving fast enough that I haven't had to stand still with it. Until now, Tahani translated. Bessa listened. Responded. She says running at the right speed looks like living. But it isn't. He looked at the fire for a while. No, he said. It isn't. Bessa said one more thing. Short. Tahani translated it with a slight pause that suggested she was deciding how directly to render it. She says, whatever you're carrying, put it down here or carry it forever. The land will decide which one you mean. He didn't sleep well that night either. But this time it was a different kind of not sleeping. Not the flat, exhausted numbness of a man who's been running. The restless, uncomfortable wakefulness of a man who has, maybe for the first time, started to feel the weight of what he's carrying. Which is worse, in the short term, and better in every way that counts. Then came Zarek on the 14th night, past the point where the camp had settled, and most of the fires were banked low. Silas heard footsteps behind him. Not sneaking, not threatening, deliberate. The footsteps of a man who wanted to be heard coming. He sat up, Zarek crouched down across from him. Same distance as a conversation. Outside the range of most confrontations. Inside the range of an honest one. He was, up close, younger than he'd seemed at the council fire. 28, maybe. Strong across the shoulders, a scar along his left jaw that was old and well-healed. His eyes were steady. Not angry, not afraid, just steady. They looked at each other for a moment. You braided rope well today, Zarek said. His English was clear, accented, exact. The English of someone who had learned it deliberately and kept only the parts that were useful. Not much else to do, Silas said. Zarek looked at his hands. Then at Silas's face. My father told me stories, he said, before he died. About the men who came in March of 1878. The ones in Army Blue. Silas went very still. He described their faces, Zarek said. The ones he saw clearly before it was over. He had a good memory, my father. He described one of them many times. He paused. The description matches you. The fire was low. The stars were out. Somewhere in the dark a coyote was making its sound. Not the howl people expected, but the yipping. Conversational call that meant it was talking to something it knew. Silas did not look away from Zarek. I know, he said. Zarek absorbed this. He'd known the answer. Still, absorbing a confirmed truth was different from holding a suspected one. His jaw tightened once, then released. You weren't going to say anything. No. Why? And here was the honest answer. Not the good answer. Not the answer that made him look better. Just the true one. Because I was afraid, Silas said. And because I didn't think it would help anything. And because I've gotten very good at not saying the difficult thing and calling it practicality. Zarek looked at him for a long time. Further away now. My father's name was Nake, Zarek said. He was 31 years old. He had 2 other children besides me. He was good with horses. He could make people laugh when there was nothing to laugh about. So Silas held that. I'm sorry, he said. The words were inadequate. He knew they were inadequate before he said them. He said them anyway, because they were the only true thing left to offer. Zarek was quiet. Then, I'm not telling you this, so you'll apologize. I'm telling you because his name should be said. By the people who were there. Nake, Silas said. The name felt different in his mouth than he expected. Not lighter, heavier, but in the way that things that are real are heavier than things that are abstract. He'd carried March of 1878 as an abstraction for 5 years. Numbers. A morning that had happened and been filed away. Not Nake. Not 31 years old. Not good with horses. I could go to Kalfas tonight, Zarek said. Tell him what I know. The council would. It would not go well for you. I know. I'm not going to do that. Silas looked at him. Not because I forgive you, Zarek said immediately. Clearly I don't. Not today. Maybe not ever. That's honest, yes, but because I want to see what you do with this. I want to see if you're the kind of man who tells the truth when he doesn't have to. Or only when he's caught. He stood up, brushed dust from his knees. You have time, he said. Not much. But some. Use it correctly. He walked back toward the camp. Silas sat in the dark for a very long time. He decided to leave on the 16th morning. He made the decision clearly, without drama. He would get up before dawn, take only what was his and go. He would walk south until he could get a horse or find a road. He would not write anything, he would not explain. He would simply go, because that was what he did. He went. He had been here long enough to make things complicated. Long enough for Zarek to see his face and make his calculation. Long enough for Lieutenant Groover's letter to have been written and the 30-day clock to be running. Long enough for Naru to bring him water and Tehani to teach him 7 words and old Bessa to maw. To look at him like she could see all the way through. Long enough, in other words, to start to matter, and Silas Cord did not, could not. He was not a person who, people who mattered were people who could also hurt things, and he had a very well-documented history of hurting things. Better to go now, before it got worse. He had his bedroll under his arm, his Colt on his hip, the tintype of Clara in his breast pocket, over his heart where it always was. He was 6 steps from the edge of camp. You're doing it again. He stopped. Tao standing between 2 wickiups directly in his path, not blocking him. She wasn't that dramatic about things. Just standing there. In the blue pre-dawn, a shawl around her shoulders, hair loose. She'd been awake. She'd been waiting. He looked at her. Old Bessa told you, he said. Old Bessa tells me a great many things. I'm going to bring trouble to this camp, he said. Groover is looking for me specifically. When they find me here. We know how to handle the army, she said. Not this kind of finding. Not with a legitimate desertion record. They'll have reason to come in force in you, Silas. The way she said his name stopped him. She'd said it before. She'd been saying it for days, but this time it had weight. Familiarity. Like it was a word she'd gotten used to the shape of. He closed his mouth. She looked at him for a long moment. The sky was beginning to change at the eastern edge. The first gray. You left your family to earn money for them, she said. Not a question. She'd been listening those evenings. Of course she had. Yes, and when they got sick, you stayed away because you thought you were helping. He didn't answer that one. And when you found out they were gone, you left the army. And when someone recognized you at the drive, you left that too. Yes, he said, quietly. You left your wiki up in your mind before you left it in your feet just now. She paused. I saw it happen. Yesterday. The day before. He didn't say anything. She took 1 step toward him. If you walk out of this canyon right now, she said, you will walk out of every place for the rest of your life. That is not living. That is just moving. He looked at the ground. What does Bessa say will happen if I stay? She doesn't tell futures. She reads what's true now, and what's true now. A pause that went on long enough to feel like a decision being made. That you are the first person, in a long time, she said, who listened to me speak, without deciding what I meant before I finished. He looked up at her. She looked back. The sky was moving from gray to something almost gold. He put the bedroll down. Not gracefully, not with significance. Just set it on the ground beside him. She didn't react to that either. She turned and walked back toward the center of camp. He stood there for a moment, then picked up the bedroll and went back to his sleeping spot. He lay down. He stared at the brightening sky. His heart was doing that thing again. Stop, he told it. Didn't stop. The council was 3 days later. He asked for it. He went to Chief Kalfas's wiki up in the morning and stood outside and waited until someone came to tell Kalfas he was there. And then he sat down with the translator and he said, clearly and without preamble, Bal, I need to tell the council something. Something I should have said when you first took me in. Kalfas looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. The council gathered by evening. The same 7 faces, plus Zarek, standing where he always stood, plus old Bessa, still as a stone, plus Tehani. At the outer ring, arms at her sides, he stood. He told them. He started with his name, his full name and rank and years of service. He told them about the Army's use of scouts in this territory. He told them about March of 1878. He told them about the orders that came from above him. He told them that he had followed those orders, that 6 people died, that he had known it was wrong while he did it and had done it anyway. He told them about Nake. He said the name. He told them he had come into this camp with that history already in his chest, that Zarek had given him a door, that Zarek, and he had almost not walked through it. He said, I'm not asking forgiveness. I don't deserve it, and I'm not owed it. I'm asking to be seen accurately as what I am, not as what's easier to believe. Then he sat down and waited. The council broke into immediate and fierce discussion. He sat with it. He didn't move. He'd started something, and it needed to be completed without him interfering with the shape of it. Some voices were loud. One man, older, heavyset, with a stillness that cracked open when he spoke, pointed at Silas and said something with a ferocity that didn't need translation. Others were quieter, more measured. Zarek said nothing for a long time, then he stood. The discussion went quiet. Zarek spoke in Chiricahua. Slowly, deliberately. The translator, after, gave Silas the shape of it, not word for word, but the essential thing. My father's name was Nake. He was 31. He was good with horses. He could make people laugh. A pause. This man said those words to me, in the dark, when he did not have to, when I was the only one who would have heard them. He did not know I would bring them here. Another pause. I have not forgiven him. I may never forgive him. That is between me and whatever I carry of my father. But this council should not make its decision based on my grief alone. My grief is mine. This decision belongs to all of us. He sat down. The discussion resumed. Lower now. Different in register. Chief Kalfas held the silence at the end of it, the way he always did, collecting the weight of everything that had been said and compressing it into stillness. He spoke, the translator. You will undergo the cleansing ceremony. Old Bessa will conduct it. After this, the council will speak again. Not to decide your guilt, that belongs to what you carry. To decide your place here, going forward. Silas exhaled. Thank you, he said, Chief. Kalfas looked at him steadily. He said one more thing, untranslated. But his eyes said what the words said, which was approximately, don't make me regret this. Silas held the gaze. I won't, he said, as if he'd heard the words perfectly. Maybe he had the cleansing ceremony happen the next morning. Old Bessa with sage, with the smoke, with words in a language older than anything Silas had been raised in, that moved through the air like something alive. He sat and received it, without flinching, without performing, without deciding what he thought about it. He felt something shift, not absolution, not the lifting of what he carried, but the possibility of carrying it differently. Upright, maybe. Not hidden, not running. Carrying it in a way where other people could see it and decide for themselves what they thought. That was not nothing. That was possibly everything. Then came Groover. 4 days after the ceremony, mid-morning. A formal approach. Rider, sent ahead, Kalfas notified. A meeting arranged at the canyon mouth with 2 senior men from the band present. Silas was not invited. He found out about it from Naru, who sat beside him, while he was working and told him, in a mix of English and Chiricahua, that took some time to decode, but the shape of it came clear: a lieutenant. From Fort Bowie, in person this time, formal papers, San Carlos 60 days, and something else. Something Naru communicated with a particular stillness, a name, Silas's name, in the meeting, written on one of the papers. He set down his work, sat for a moment, then walked to the edge of camp where you could see the canyon mouth. Far enough to be invisible, close enough to see. Groover was young for a lieutenant, mid-30s maybe. Neat. The kind of military bearing that came from believing in things. Not a bad man, probably. Men who believed in things were often not bad men. They were often the most dangerous kind of not bad men, because they had orders and principle both, which meant they had reasons that felt clean. He was speaking to Kalfas's men with what looked like genuine courtesy. He was also clearly asking about something specific, because one of Kalfa's men glanced toward camp once, just once. But in Silas' general direction, he went back to his work that evening. Tehani came to his fire spot without being asked, earlier than usual. Her face was the careful, controlled face she used when things were complicated. "He knows you're here," she said. "Yes, my father is speaking with the senior men tonight. What are his options?" She was quiet for a moment, working through how much to translate honestly versus diplomatically. She chose honestly. "If you are here when the Army comes to survey in less than 10 days now, they have a formal record. A deserter found in an Apache camp. It complicates everything for us. The land discussion, the negotiations, all of it. And if I'm gone before then there's no record." She didn't say, "So you should go." She didn't say, "You should stay." She was giving him what she knew and letting him hold it. He looked at the fire. "What did Groover want specifically?" "A beat. He asked my father to confirm your presence. Formally. For the record, what did your father say?" The corner of her mouth moved. "Just barely. He said he had no Army scouts in his camp." Silas looked up. She met his eyes. "That was technically true at the time of the meeting," she said, "because the Council's decision is that you are no longer Army. You are here in a different capacity. That's a very fine technical line. My father draws fine lines carefully, and then, under the technical line and the careful drawing, was the other thing. The thing neither of them said out loud. Kalfas had protected him, not fully, not permanently, not without cost. But, he had protected him." Silas looked at the firefighter for a long. "Then, what does Groover do next?" She sat down across from him, put her hands in her lap, looked at him directly, which she didn't always do. This version of looking at him was different from the assessing look. This was something else. "He comes back," she said, "in his own time. With what he decides to do with what he knows, he'll come with force, probably. He can't let it sit. Not with the survey timeline. No." A long pause. "The fire between them, Silas," she said. And again his name had that weight, that familiarity, that unsettling quality of being said by someone who had looked at him long enough to know it fit. "I know," he said. "You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say that you're not afraid of what's coming." She considered that. "I was going to say I'm not afraid of it alone," she said, "which is different." He looked at her. She looked back. The fire crackled between them, and Silas Cord, who had been alone for 3 years, who had built aloneness into a system, a survival strategy, a personality trait, felt something give way inside his chest, quietly, without drama, like a door that had been warped shut for years, finally swinging open on a dry day. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They sat together at the fire until the desert went cold, and the stars came out in their impossible numbers, and the coyote started its conversation somewhere in the dark distance, and neither one of them moved toward the other, and neither one of them moved away. And that was everything. They left before dawn, just the two of them. Horses moving quiet through the canyon mouth, while the stars were still out and the desert was still the cold, blue-dark version of itself that it only allowed for an hour each morning. Before the heat came, before the light made everything harsh again, Chief Kalfas had asked for a scout report on Groover's position, how many men, where they'd camped, whether the survey team had arrived yet. From Tucson, Silas could read army movement patterns. Tihani could read the land itself. Together they covered ground neither of them could have covered alone. That was the logic. The logic was also a reason to be somewhere together without the weight of the camp, watching. They both knew that. Neither said it. The Dragoon Mountains at night were a different country than the Dragoon Mountains in day. Cooler, quieter. The granite formations that looked brutal in full sun went soft in moonlight, like they were made of something more forgiving than rock. Like the darkness gave them permission to be something other than what they had to be during the hours when everything could see them. Silas understood that completely. Tihani moved through the dark like she'd been doing it her whole life. Which she had. She chose paths he wouldn't have found. Not trails exactly, more like intentions between rocks. Places where the land had agreed to let you pass if you moved correctly. By the time the sky started going gray at the edges, they'd covered 8 miles and had a clean sightline down into the valley where Groover's company had made camp, 14 men. 2 supply wagons, a civilian with surveying equipment, and a rider who'd come in after dark and whose horse was still wet from hard travel. That last part was the thing. Silas looked at the lathered horse, looked at Tihani. She'd already seen it, dispatch, he said. Fast dispatch. Something changed, she nodded. They pulled back from the ridge before the light got good enough to make them visible. Found a narrow slot canyon 50 yards back and settled in to wait. He sat against one wall of the slot. She sat against the other. 3 feet between them. The canyon walls above were lightening. The sky turning from gray to that first pale gold. Neither spoke for a while. What will Groover do with the dispatch, she said. Depends what it says. What could it say that would change his timeline? He thought about that. Authorization for accelerated survey, he said. Or new orders about dealing with uncooperative bands. Or, he stopped. She waited. Or someone in the chain identified me, formally. Put pressure on Groover to resolve the situation. Before the survey creates a public record of the problem. She looked at him. Someone who'd rather you weren't found. Someone who'd rather I wasn't found alive, he said, plainly. Just the accurate version of it. The man who gave the order in 1878, she said. Colonel Hurst. He's a general now. Fort Lowell. He knows you know. He's always known. As long as I was moving and staying quiet, it wasn't worth the trouble of dealing with me. But if I get formally documented in Army records in connection with an Apache band in the Dragoons, then you become a thread someone might pull, and Hurst is a man who cuts threads. She looked at the strip of sky visible above the slot canyon. Thinking, he reached into his jacket. What he brought out was folded, small, worn at the creases from years of being carried without being opened. He held it for a moment without unfolding it. I've had this since March of 1878, he said. I took it. I don't know entirely why. Maybe I knew even then that carrying it was the only honest thing I was going to do that day. He handed it to her. She unfolded it carefully. Read it. Her English was strong enough for the formal language of military orders. She read slowly, getting every word, Colonel Hurst's signature. Clear and confident at the bottom. Authorization for a punitive action against the Chiricahua encampment in the Dragoon foothills, March 7, 1878. Punitive action. Not defensive. Not protective. Punitive, she refolded it, held it in both hands. The weight of it, this destroys him, she said, if it reaches the right hands. Yes, you've carried this for 5 years. Yes, why haven't you used it? He leaned his head back against the rock. Because using it meant standing still long enough to be heard, he said, and I wasn't ready to stand still. She looked at him. He looked at the sky. I might be ready now, he said. The morning opened up above them, gold going to blue, an eagle catching the first thermal, circling wide and patient over the valley below. She gave the paper back to him. He took it. Their hands touched. Neither moved away, just that. The contact of two hands in the morning light, in a narrow slot of ancient rock, while an eagle circled overhead, and an army camp stirred awake in the valley below. Just that. Which was everything. Back in camp by mid-morning, Silas went directly to Calphas and reported what he'd seen. The numbers, the supply wagons, the late-arriving rider. Calphas listened without interrupting, then asked one question through the translator. "How much time?" "A week," Silas said. "Maybe less." Calphas nodded slowly and said something. The translator rendered it. He says, "Old Bessa has a contact, a man in Tucson. She has known him for 12 years. She says he can be trusted with documents that need to go east without being opened on the way." Silas looked at the old woman, who was sitting 20 feet away doing something with dried plants, and who was absolutely listening to every word. She didn't look up. He almost laughed. He did not laugh. "But almost. Ask old Bessa," he said. "If her contact in Tucson needs the document brought to him, or if he can send someone to collect it." Bessa said something without being asked, without looking up from her plants. The translator. "She says she already sent word to him 3 days ago." A pause. "She says she's been waiting for you to stop dithering." He looked at the old woman's back, still not looking up, still doing her plants. "Right. 3 days ago," he said, "before the council." Before, Bessa said something else. "She says the land tells her things early. She finds it more efficient." He sat with that. "All right," he said. "All right." 2 days later, 6 days before the survey deadline, Groover moved, not with the full company. He moved with 4 men. Early morning. Using a route through the southern approach to the canyon that bypassed the main lookout, which meant someone had talked. Silas didn't know that yet when it happened. What he knew was this. He was splitting firewood in the mid-morning when Naru came running. Not the careful, deliberate movement of someone conveying information. Running. Flat out. He dropped the axe. "Soldiers," Naru said. He was breathing hard. Southern approach. 4 men. They have. He stopped. Something moved in his face. Something young and frightened fighting with something that had decided not to be frightened anymore. "They have me," he said. Silas went very still. "What?" "Danu, Naru." He was mixing his own name up, the boy. The fear was doing something to his words. He was Naru. He was here. So who was taken then? It landed. "Danu," Silas said. The younger boy, Naru's younger brother, 12 years old, who sometimes followed the horses around the corral. They took him from the southern grazing area. Before the lookout could, Naru's voice stopped working, because he was 16, and his little brother was 12, and the world had just demonstrated to him how fast the terms of a situation could change. Silas grabbed him by both arms. "Steady. Direct. Where's Tahani?" "With my father." The message came. He was already moving. The message came attached to a folded piece of paper, left at the canyon approach with a stone on top of it. 3 sentences. Army Formal Silas Cord was requested to present himself to Lieutenant Groover's position at the southern approach by midday. In exchange, the Apache child currently in Army custody would be returned unharmed. Failure to comply would result in the child being transported to Fort Bowie pending formal documentation of his status as an unregistered dependent. Tahani was holding the paper when Silas came into Calphas's wiki-up. Her face was controlled, completely controlled. The way faces go when the person wearing them has decided that if they let one thing move, everything will move, and they can't afford that right now. But her hands were shaking, very slightly. The paper trembling just enough to see. He looked at her. She looked at him. He looked at Calphas. "I'm going," he said. Calphas said something short. The translator started to render it. He says, "You will not." "I'm going," Silas said again. Not loud, not argumentative. The way you say a thing when it's already decided and the only remaining question is logistics. Calphas held his eyes. "Said something different this time," he says. "This is what they want. You walking out alone is what they came for." "Yes," Silas said. "It is. Then why?" "Because Danu is 12 years old," Silas said. And because this is the only thing I can do that doesn't require anyone else to pay for my history. Silence. He looked at Tahani. She was looking at him with an expression that had moved past, controlled into something raw. Frightened, not for herself, for him, which was somehow worse. He didn't tell her not to be frightened. He didn't tell her it would be fine. He had a strict personal policy against lying about things that mattered. What he said was, "Trust Zarek." She shook her head once. "Tight, Silas. Trust Zarek," he said again. "He'll know what to do." He turned before she could say anything else. Because if she said something else, he might not go. And Danu was 12 years old. He went to his sleeping spot first, took the folded paper from his jacket. The order from March 1878. Looked at it for a moment, then put it back. Then he checked the Colt. Loaded. Good. Then he did one more thing. He went to the edge of the corral where the horses were, found the bay gelding, put his hand on the animal's neck. The horse turned its head and looked at him with that enormous, frank, completely unambiguous equine eye. "I'll be back for you," he said. The horse blinked. Probably not a meaningful blink. Probably just a blink. He chose to take it as agreement. He walked out of the camp without looking back. Because if he looked back, he would see Tahani standing somewhere watching him go. And he had made a rule years ago about looking at things he couldn't keep. He was trying to unmake that rule. But not yet, not this specific moment, one thing at a time. Groover's position was a flat shelf of rock at the canyon's southern approach. Good ground. Clear sightlines in 3 directions. Danu was sitting on a rock in the center of the position, a rope around his wrists. Loose enough to be technically humane. Tight enough to be completely clear. He was not crying. Silas registered that as the first thing. 12 years old, and they'd taken him by surprise and tied his wrists, and he was not crying. He was sitting upright on that rock with his chin level and looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who has decided that the people holding him will not see anything from him that they can use. That was Kalfas's blood. That was Chiricahua blood. Silas walked forward and didn't raise his hands. Not yet. You didn't volunteer surrender. That read as fear, and he wasn't afraid. And there was no reason to create an impression that wasn't true. Groover stepped forward. Up close, the lieutenant was younger than the formality of his correspondence suggested. Maybe 35. A face that was built for belief. The kind of face that had probably been earnest all the way through West Point, and was only now starting to run into situations where earnestness created problems. "Silas Cord," he said, confirming. "Not asking, Lieutenant Groover," Silas said. "You know why I'm here. I know several reasons you might be here." "Which one are we starting with?" Groover's jaw tightened slightly. Men who'd been cornered usually came in one of 2 modes, aggressive or collapsed. This was neither. "I have orders to take you to Fort Bowie for processing," Groover said. Desertion, abandonment of post. 1879. "All right. And I have additional, informal, instructions regarding your disposition. From a senior officer, Hurst." The name landed. Groover went very still. Then very carefully did not react, which was a reaction. "I'm not at liberty to." "Hurst told you to make sure I don't make it to Fort Bowie," Silas said.
Flat.
Not angry. Factual. Or he told someone who told you. However it traveled, a long beat. That's a serious accusation. Groover said. "I have a serious document in my jacket pocket," Silas said. Signed by Hurst. March 1878. "Which you can have right now, or you can take me to Fort Bowie and let it go through official channels." Which is going to be a very uncomfortable process for a lot of people. Groover looked at him. This was the thing about earnest men. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes, when you gave them a truth that was large enough, they couldn't look away from it. They'd been trained on believing in the thing the Army was supposed to be. And when the thing the Army was supposed to be and the thing the Army was actually doing diverged too far, sometimes the belief won, not always. "Sometimes let the boy go," Silas said. and I'll give you the document and walk to Fort Bowie on my own feet and let the official process do what it does. And if I don't, then someone has the document and I'm gone, and the official process still happens, just without me in a cell when it does. A pause. Someone has it, Groover repeated. 3 days ago, Silas said. Before you moved. Yes, which was true. Old Bessa's contact in Tucson had come himself. A weathered man in a surveyor's coat who'd arrived 2 days prior and left 3 hours later with a copy of the order carefully rendered in Tahani's precise handwriting. Because Silas has handwriting, was frankly not up to the task. Groover looked at the ground. He was running calculations. The math of a man who understood suddenly that the situation had more dimensions than the briefing had described. The child, Silas said. Quiet. He's 12. Groover looked at Danu. The Danu looked back at him. 12 years old. Chin level, not giving him anything. Something moved in Groover's face. He nodded to one of his men. The rope came off Danu's wrists. Danu stood. Rolled his shoulders once. Because the rope had been uncomfortable, and he was 12, and he was allowed 1 moment of acknowledging that. Then he looked at Silas. Silas looked at him. Go, he said. Fast. Danu went. The sound of his footsteps on the rock, moving away. Getting quieter. Gone, Silas reached into his jacket and took out the folded order. He held it out. Groover took it, opened, read it. Read his face did several things. None of them comfortable. I'll need you to come to Fort Bowie, he said. Quieter now. I know, Silas said. I can't make promises about how this. I know that too. Groover looked at him. Why are you doing this? He meant it honestly. The way people ask questions when the ant genuinely escapes them, Silas thought about it. Because I'm done moving, he said. And standing still means dealing with what I've been carrying. Groover held the paper. This will damage Hearst, he said. Yes, it might not be enough. Might not be, Silas agreed, but it'll make noise. And noise is harder to bury than one man. Groover folded the paper. Put it inside his own jacket. Move out, he said to his men. Quietly, and they began to move. Except they were 20 yards from the camp's southern approach when the sound came. Not loud, not dramatic. The sound of horses, several of them, moving from the high ground to the east. Groover's men went for weapons. Hold, Groover said, sharp. Immediate, because he'd assessed what Silas had already assessed. The positioning was high ground, the number was sufficient, and the men coming down were not moving like an attack. They were moving like people who wanted to be seen, who had made a decision about showing up. Zarek came down first, 6 men behind him, positioned around the high ground like punctuation marks. Present, visible, not aggressive, just. Absolutely, there. Zarek stopped his horse and looked at Groover. Groover looked at Zarek. Silas stood between them. Is there a problem? Zarek said to Groover. Careful English, measured. No problem, Groover said, after a beat. We're moving out, good, Zarek said. He looked at Silas. Silas looked back. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not friendship, not yet, maybe not ever, exactly, but something real. Something that acknowledged that 2 men had been on opposite sides of the worst morning of both their lives, and had found themselves here, in this canyon, on this day, choosing to be something other than the worst version of what that morning made them. Zarek inclined his head. Silas did the same. Groover's men moved. Silas moved with them. He was gone 3 weeks, which was 1 week longer than anyone had expected, and 4 days longer than Tahani had been able to sleep properly. Not that she'd told anyone that. She'd spent those 3 weeks doing what needed doing. Camp, work, horse care, sitting with old Bessa in the evenings, helping her father navigate the continued back and forth with the Army's survey team, which had arrived and was being handled with the particular combination of dignity and intractability that Kalfas had spent a lifetime perfecting. She did not watch the southern approach every morning. She watched it every morning. When he came back, it was late afternoon, which was not when she'd been watching. Naturally, because of course, she was at the horses when Naru came to get her. Not running this time. Walking fast, but walking. His face doing something she hadn't seen on him before. "He's here," Naru said. "South approach." Walking, she was already moving. He looked like he'd been through something. Not physically destroyed, he was upright, moving under his own power. Nothing obviously broken, but thinner. A week of army food, which was never good, and something in his eyes that was different from when he'd left. Clearer, maybe. Like a window after rain. She stopped in front of him and looked at him the way she looked at things she was deciding about. He looked back. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "You're late. The army processes things slowly, Hurst." Under formal inquiry, the document went to Washington 3 days before I got to Fort Bowie. By the time I arrived there were already 2 officers asking Groover questions he wasn't comfortable answering, and Groover, cooperating, Sla said. "He's an earnest man." Earnest men cooperate when they've seen the thing clearly. She held his eyes. "And you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Free to go," he said, "for now. The desertion charge is complicated by the evidence in the document. It'll take time, but they let you leave. They might leave." "Leave," she exhaled. The first complete exhale in 3 weeks. "You came back," she said. "I said I would. You didn't say it explicitly. I said it to the horse." She blinked. "You said it to the bay gelding." "Before I left, I told him I'd be back." She stared at him. He was almost smiling. Not quite, but almost. The particular expression of a man who has learned that the situation occasionally allows for almost smiling and is testing whether this is one of those times. "You made a commitment to a horse," she said. "I keep my commitments to horses, to things I intend to come back to," and there it was. The thing under the thing, said sideways, said in the only register he had, which was quiet and indirect and absolutely, completely clear if you'd been paying attention, which she had been. She looked at him. He looked at her. The desert around them was going gold in the late afternoon light. That specific gold that happened here, and almost nowhere else. The light that made the red rock redder, and the shadows deeper, and the sky the exact color of something you wanted to hold on to. She put one hand against his chest. Not dramatic, just placing her hand there. Over where the photograph of Clara lived. Over where his heart was underneath that. He put his hand over hers. Neither of them moved. Chief Kalfas held a council 3 days later, not about the army, not about Hurst. Those situations were in motion and would continue to move whether the council discussed them or not. The council was about Silas, about his place, about what the band had decided, in the way bands decided things, not all at once, not by vote, but by the gradual accumulation of individual choices that eventually became a collective position. Silas sat before the fire. Kalfas spoke for a long time. The translator rendered it carefully. "You came to us without permission. You had history with this band that you did not immediately disclose. You stayed. You worked. You stood before this council and told the truth when it cost you. You walked into danger on behalf of a child of this band." A pause. "These things together do not make you one of us. That takes longer. That takes things we cannot vote into being." Another pause. "But they make you something. A man who has chosen where to stand. A man who can choose it again. The land has seen you standing here. That is not nothing." Kalfas said something directly to Zarek. Zarek responded. Brief, the translator rendered. Zarek says he doesn't speak for his father's spirit. Only his father spoke for that. But he says his father was a man who believed that what you did with your life after your worst moment was the real story. He says, "Write a better story." Silas looked at Zarek. Zarek looked back, not warm, not fully. That was going to take a long time and might never arrive, and that was honest. But not away either, not closed. Something in between, which was real, which was more than nothing. Which was, in the way of this land and these people, and this specific kind of truth. Enough to build on. The wedding happened on a clear morning 2 weeks later, not because everything was resolved, not because the army situation was settled, or the survey was finished, or the world had become the kind of place where this made easy sense, because Tihani had gone to her father and said what she had to say. Directly. In the way she said everything. He has a good heart, she said. He has learned how to stop. And he knows who I am without trying to make me something simpler. Kalfas had been quiet for a long time. Then, and you know who he is? All of it? All of it, she said. That's why. He'd looked at her for a long time, with the expression of a father who understands that his child has already decided, and is asking for his blessing, not his permission. He gave the blessing. The morning of it, Silas made something. He'd been working on it for 10 days in whatever time he had alone. A comb. Carved from the horn of a pronghorn that had died, naturally near the camp's eastern grazing area. He'd found it himself, which felt important, which felt like the land offering something, rather than him taking it. The carving was not fine work. He was not a fine craftsman. He had made it with the limited skill he had, and more time and attention than he'd given to almost anything in years. Small patterns at the edges, imperfect, entirely deliberate. He held it in the morning light before the ceremony, and looked at it for a long time. It wasn't beautiful. The way beautiful things were beautiful. It was beautiful the way honest things were beautiful. The way something made by imperfect hands, with genuine care, had its own kind of value that nothing perfect could replicate. He thought that was probably true about more things than combs. The ceremony was as Tehani had described to him in fragments over the preceding weeks. Old Bessa presided. She carried Tadidine, Katile pollen, the blessing substance, the Chiricahua, used in their most sacred ceremonies, yellow, fine, catching the morning light, like something between dust and gold. She scattered it over them both. A blessing, an intention, a prayer spoken without words. Old Bessa spoke in Chiricahua then. Words he didn't fully understand, but whose shape he could feel, the weight of old language, the weight of something that had been done this way for longer than either of them had been alive. He gave her the comb. She looked at it in her hands, turned it over, ran her thumb along the carving at the edge. She looked up at him. "You made this," she said. "Badly," he said. Carefully, she corrected. He didn't argue with that. She put it in her hair, right then, in front of everyone, which he understood was its own kind of statement. You didn't do something for show here. You did it because you meant it. She meant it. He understood he was going to have to adjust to being someone who was meant. It was going to take some getting used to. He was looking forward to it. Kalfa stood before them at the end of the ceremony. The full band present. The morning light full on all of them. He spoke. This land has seen much blood, the translator rendered. It has seen people come and take and go. It has seen its own people broken and scattered and returned. It has seen everything that people do to each other when they are afraid. A pause. Today it sees something else. He looked at Silas directly. You are not Chiricahua, he said. You will not be Chiricahua. But you can be a man who lives as if the land matters, as if the people on it matter. That is enough. That has always been enough, he said. One more thing that the translator rendered quietly, just for Silas. My daughter chose you. I chose to trust her choice. Don't make either of us wrong. No, sir, Silas said. He meant it completely. Zarek came to him that evening. The celebration was still going. Fire and drums, and the kind of laughter that comes from people who've had a hard season and found a reason to set it down for a night. Silas was sitting slightly outside the main gathering, not leaving, just breathing the outside air for a minute. Habit, Zarek sat down beside him. They didn't speak for a while. The fire was loud. The drums were steady. The stars were doing their aggressive Arizona thing. My father, Zarek said finally, would have hated you. Silas looked at him. In the beginning, Zarek said, he would have hated you. He had very specific feelings about army men. Reasonable, Silas said. Yes. Zarek was quiet, but he was also a man who updated his feelings when the evidence changed. That was something he taught me. He said, the feeling is real, but it is not the final word. Keep looking. Silas held that. I'm still looking, Zarek said. At you. At what you do with this, I know. That's going to continue. Good, Silas said. Keeps me honest. Zarek was quiet for a moment. Then, without looking at him, almost too casual, you split firewood decently. Thank you, not great. Decent, I'll work on it. See that you do, and that was all. Zarek stood, went back to the fire, rejoined the celebration. With the ease of a man in his own place among his own people, Silas watched him go. He sat for another minute in the outside air. He thought about Clara. He thought about Thomas. He thought about a small farm in Missouri and the particular weight of choices that seemed reasonable at the time. He thought about March of 1878 and a man named Na Kay, who had been 31 years old and good with horses and able to make people laugh. He put his hand over his breast pocket. Not just Clara now. The comb shavings were in there too. Small curls of horn from something he'd made. That was new. That was different. He was going to be making things now. Instead of leaving them, he got up and went back to the fire. The months that followed were not simple. The Army situations moved the way. Army situations move. Slowly with setbacks. With the particular frustration of watching institutions process things at institutional speed. Hearst was investigated. The investigation took longer than it should have. He had powerful friends. Documents moved through channels that sometimes lost them. But the noise Silas had counted on, it stayed noise. It didn't go quiet. The Tucson contact, whose name was Ames, and who turned out to be a former military man himself, with specific opinions about men like Hearst, made sure of that. He knew newspaper men. He knew congressional staffers. He had, as old Bessa had apparently always known, the right connections in the right places. The survey of the Dragoon Mountain region concluded, without the formal documentation of problems that would have triggered the next step towards San Carlos. Not permanently resolved. These things never resolved permanently, but set aside. Complicated enough that moving on it wasn't the path of least resistance for now. For now was what you worked with out here. And Silas Cord, who had spent 3 years moving because stopping felt impossible, learned what his wife had always known, that for now was enough to build on, that you didn't need certainty to invest, that you didn't need guarantees to stay. You just needed to decide that something was worth the staying. By the end of that first year, he split good firewood. Not decent. Good. Zarek said so once, briefly, while walking past. It was one of the best things anyone had said to him in years. He learned more Chiricahua. Not fluency, but enough to follow what people were laughing about. Enough to know when old Bessa was saying something adjacent to him that he was meant to absorb. He absorbed them. The bay gelding remained the best horse he'd worked with since losing his own. He told the horse this. The horse blinked. He took that as agreement. The seasons changed around him and he changed with them. Slowly. The way real change happens, not in declarations or dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of ordinary days where you make a slightly different choice than you would have made before, where you reach for patience instead of distance, where you sit with discomfort instead of manufacturing reasons to move. He was not the same man who had walked out of Offield's camp with nothing but a colt and a dead woman's photograph and a habit of leaving. He was not entirely different either. The scars were still there, the stone in his chest, lighter now, more manageable, but still there. It would always be there. He had come to understand that carrying it wasn't the problem. The problem had been the carrying in secret, alone, running fast enough that he didn't have to feel the weight of it. Here, other people could see it, could acknowledge it existed, could decide for themselves what they thought, and he could live with their decisions. And that turned out to be not just survivable, but something closer to honest than anything he'd managed in years. The mornings were the best part, before the camp was fully awake, before the heat came. That blue dark hour when the desert was still the soft, forgiving version of itself. He would sit outside their wickiup and watch the sky change. Sometimes Tahani sat with him. Sometimes she slept longer and he sat alone. Both were good. Both were different kinds of good. On one of those mornings, the sky going from dark to gray to the first gold, the birds starting their noise, the horses stirring in the corral, he found himself thinking about what he would tell Thomas. If Thomas were alive, if Thomas were here, if he were old enough to be told things, he would say, "The choices that define you aren't usually the big ones. They're the small ones. The ones that seem reasonable, the ones that seem practical, the ones you make at the edge of a moment and walk away from without looking back. Look back. Stay long enough to look back, and if you've made the wrong choice, keep going anyway. Not away from it, through it, toward whatever is on the other side of standing still." Because something was on the other side, he'd found that out. The last morning of that first year, he stood on the ridge above the canyon and looked south. The Dragoon Mountains spread around him. Red granite. Massive. Patient. The sky above them, the brutal, beautiful blue that didn't apologize for itself. Tehani stood beside him. The gray mare was below, visible in the corral, moving in her slow morning way. The camp was waking up. Smoke rising. Voices. Children being argued toward breakfast. He looked at all of it. Then at her. She was looking at the horizon. That particular look she had when she was reading something in the distance that he couldn't see yet. He'd learned to wait when she had that look. She always told him eventually. "What do you see?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "The same things as yesterday," she said. "And different." He looked back at the horizon. "Understood, yeah," he said. "Same." The wind came up from the south. Warm already, even this early, carrying dust, and the smell of creosote, and the endless, specific scent of the desert, after it had rained somewhere 60 miles away, and the air was carrying it like a message. He put his hand in hers. She didn't look at him. But her hand turned over and held his back. And that was the thing about Tehani. She didn't perform her feelings. She didn't announce them or display them for an audience. When she trusted you with something, her time, her knowledge, her hand in the early morning light, it was because she had decided to, and the decision was complete. And she didn't need to underline it with words. He was learning to speak that language, slowly. The way he'd learned those 7 words on the 12th evening in camp, through repetition, through getting it wrong, through her patient silence while he figured out the shape of it. Stop. That one she'd taught him last. With emphasis, he finally understood why, and below them the camp moved into its day. And around them the mountains held their ancient, indifferent, absolutely reliable shape. And above them the sky did what it always did. Opened up enormous and blue and without apology. And Silas Cord, who had been moving for 3 years, who had been moving for 32, stood still. Some men spend their whole lives running from who they were. The lucky ones. They find a place worth stopping for.